Hey everybody, welcome to this week's live stream. So this is week 26 and we have been talking about world building now for quite a while. Today we are going to continue last week's conversation and be talking about storytelling and world building. Now this is a continuation of last week's talk. So if you have not seen last week's talk, you may want to watch that first, or just be aware that you're kind of jumping in midstream today. So hopefully this would make sense to you. And then in general, we've been talking about world building for the last 6 or so weeks. And keep in mind that this conversation, while heavily influenced, and for games and game developers, game designers, would still be, very, very, very applicable to anyone who's an artist, whether you're in movies or games or anything, anybody who's an aspiring writer, storyteller, anything, a lot of the techniques and stuff that we're talking about are more broadly applicable into a lot of different genres, a lot of different fields. And this is not just a game-only conversation. Today, especially, we'll be trying to talk about some subjects that are more akin, for artists and people like that are, trying to understand how do you work story into kind of all aspects of your project and not just, not just as a game designer, right? And this is something that's often, the story is often driven by the game design, the creative director or people who are driving the project, or it's sometimes seen as, being what the writers do. But in reality, storytelling is really what the team does. And so whether you are a writer, whether you're a game designer, whether you're an artist, or anybody else really on the team, you're probably going to get involved in the art of storytelling and the kind of the nuances that go into storytelling across all aspects of it, in some way, shape, or form throughout your project, assuming your project has story. Again, I recognize not every game has a story in it. Not every game has a big story in it, but this topic today is more about where and how story-based games are built and designed and kind of created. So that being said, again, I hope everybody's doing great. Big Glob, good to see you again. Thanks for always being here. And all my regulars and everybody else, thanks again for joining me today. Hopefully I'll do okay. I've got a raging headache today, so I'll apologize in advance. Maybe I'm going to be a little bit spaced out today, but hopefully this headache from hell will last or will end soon. So going on several days of migraines right now, so hopefully this will clear itself. So hang in there today. If I'm a little out of it, I do apologize. So I'm going to recap just really, really quick what we talked about last week. And again, a lot of the topics that we are going to talk about, a lot of the topics that, that we're covering in this kind of chapter of storytelling are really broadly applicable, into, again, whether you're a writer, or a storyteller or a game designer, whether you write movie scripts, whether you write any kind of things. There's a million books out there. There's tons and tons of books on, anything from story building, storytelling, world building, subsets of like script writing. Like how do you actually write the words versus come up with the ideas? And so today is more ideation. It's more about really we're talking about how do you build stories and things, right? And how do you create the stories within your product? This is not about the art and craft and, of being a great writer, right? That's a whole entire course in and of itself. How to write great stories, how to write great dialogue, things like that. That's definitely going to be topics for later days and literally probably, hopefully someday an entire course. So don't expect, in these couple hours to become a masterful writer, right? That's something just like becoming a great artist or a game designer or anything else. Being a great writer does take a lot of time, does take a lot of practice, and each type of writing, like writing really great dialogue versus writing really good, science fiction novels versus writing a good movie script or even a good TV script compared to movie scripts. writing sci-fi and fantasy. Like, they all have their nuances, right? It's not too different than if you are a game designer who's designing a first-person shooter or designing a real-time strategy game. There is a lot of similarities there, right? And so keep that in mind, that you need to use your brain. You got to kind of use your brain to figure out what works right for you, and what is the way that you need to work within your particular product, your project, your team, things like that. And so remember that none of this is like hard set rules, right? These are all things that are kind of food for thought and just things to inspire you. But you really do need to kind of figure out what's right for you, in the grand scheme of things. So let's jump in really quick. Let's talk about kind of world building sort of in general, and talk about just this recap of kind of what we talked about last week. And we'll just cover this in a couple minutes. So we talked about, narrative and story and kind of what those were. So you kind of understand, what are you trying to do, when you're creating these events, right? When you're trying to do creating these sequences. And ultimately, one of the reasons why game stories typically can be or often are so complex, but again, some games have really simple stories, right? Some games have incredibly deep, detailed stories. If you go play The Witcher, you go play a lot of RPGs, their stories are layers upon layers upon layers of depth. So you have, master plots, and then you have all of these just sometimes hundreds or thousands of subplots. And some of those matter, and some of those are really just like quests and things for you to do, right? And so understanding the purpose of story, understanding what story is there to accomplish in your game is really important, right? And you need to kind of understand, like, how does that story work for you in your project, right? And so that's where you kind of have to understand, is this like something that's really important to you, or is this just something that's kind of some filler that's gonna give you something to do as a game player, right? And so then we talked last week about stories being designer or writer or whatever, i.e. the team creates some stories and the players create their own stories just by playing. Right? And you need to understand kind of that autonomy, that player autonomy, and that need for that, and that both are really good. And there's not necessarily rights or wrong. Some games try to create very little designer-driven or team-driven or whatever, pre-created stories, and opt more for a lot of user stories, a lot of player-generated stories. I like both, right? They both have their times and places for being, useful, for you. The next is, understanding what motivates players, right? You need to understand, what and why and how, people are functioning, because in the end, everything is really about emotions, right? And you really do need to understand that emotion drives everything, and that emotion drives the player himself. The player, is the player, meaning the guy that's holding that controller. And there's that player character, right? That persona that's on screen that you're representing, or that you're playing as, or maybe there's multiple ones you're playing as within your game, and you want to make sure that both emotional states are understood, and that both, and then the emotional states of the other characters, in the game, or the other players, in the game are understood, and that all those things kind of have to align, and there can be this disconnect in reality when your player character is having one set of emotions, but me as a player, I'm having a different set of emotions, and I haven't connected those two together. It can create a weird set of uncomfortableness, with the player himself, because he kind of goes, well, the player character is all upset, and I'm not upset, and why is he all upset? Because that's not the way I feel, and he's trying to be that persona on screen, right? So there's that disconnect there. Then we talked about just kind of like what's in a story, right? What are all these things that go into a story, the different types of stories there are, if you're telling stories for information, if you're telling backstory, if you're foreshadowing something, stories can be used, as immediate action of things you need to do, and story can be, mythological or historical or, contextual, and do all sorts of different things for the player. But you need to understand, and usually I like to define what are the different types of stories that I have in the game. And also something that I didn't really talk about last week, but we'll talk about more is what's the mechanics for telling stories, right? How are the types of stories being told? And sometimes you need to have a consistency between those. So this is something that you need to understand that, like, like for example, the most obvious storytelling thing is a cutscene, right? Or just a movie, right? And that could be, the most common thing of just, I'm going to have a intro cutscene, an outro, and maybe some other cutscenes throughout a game. And the player just watches them for 30 seconds. They could be pre-rendered, they could be in-game, doesn't matter. And that's one type of mechanic, right? An interactive cutscene might be one that's, like a lot of Telltale games or things used to have, where they would have some level of interactivity in a cutscene, but you're predominantly watching, but you might have some interactivity. There's a wide range of possibilities there. You might have some information that's spoken through dialogue and character conversations. You might have some dialogue that's written down in like books that I can read. And so I find that you want to try to align the storytelling techniques with the type of story and the type of information that the player wants. And if you can really align those well, that helps you in consistency because it becomes a rule. And those rules, as you hear me talk about, are very important in consistency of game design and stuff. So, for example, if I'm the type of player who doesn't care about secondary stories, doesn't care about backstory and the world and the history, I just want to go in and kill things, right? And there is types of players like that. Then I'm going to avoid, in certain, let's say RPGs or whatever, I might not pick up a book and read the book because I know that it's just backstory. I know that it doesn't matter to my game. I know it doesn't matter to what I'm doing minute to minute. It's there and it's interesting, and I can read it if I choose to. But by knowing that rule, I'll know to avoid books, and especially if they have no value, I can't trade them in, I can't do something. And that rule needs to be consistent if you really want to make it a great experience. Because if some books are really important and some books aren't, and those aren't distinguished in some way, shape, or form, then the player gets confused, right? Now he gets frustrated because every single book he's got to pick up, he's got to look through it, he's got to see if it's important, he's got to know what information is important, and he'll get lost in the clutter, right? And so that's the kind of thing where you want to sort of make sure that the stories that you're telling and the techniques that you tell those stories in are really well understood for players. That they really need to know what's really critical, what's kind of nice to know, and and what's not important at all. And that not important stuff doesn't mean that shouldn't be there. I mean, it can be there to enrich your games. It's okay. But try not to make everything critical, right? Same thing with cutscenes and stuff like that. If you just do these super long, elaborate storytelling cutscenes, and you try to force players to watch them, which generally players won't, and there may even be mechanics within the game, that the player doesn't even have to. I mean, the player can skip a lot of cutscenes and stuff too, right? And so that can become this problem where you're like, oh, I got this, really elaborate cutscene. I want the players to watch it, to learn some information that's going to help them in the game. But, if 90% of your players are going to skip it, then you're going to be in trouble, right? Because now they're missing information that they didn't get out of that cutscene. And so, again, if cutscenes are always kind of secondary information, if cutscenes are always optional or can be skipped or just things that drag on too long, then that you've kind of failed as a game designer sometimes, because you've got to recognize that people are either zoning out, not watching it, skipping it, and therefore the information you're trying to give them becomes irrelevant because they're a lot of people aren't going to see it, and now they're just going to be even that much more confused. And so the methodologies for how we deliver our story, for how we make it digestible for the mass audience, for our typical player types and things like that, is just as important as the information itself, right? And just being aware that sometimes less is more. We want to give these really elaborate stories sometimes. We want to have these big elaborate conversations and stuff, and and try to understand, is that really, really, really important? And if not, then let's tell that story in a different way. Let's tell that story in some way that the player sort of knows that it maybe is secondary, and therefore that type of player that enjoys that stuff can enjoy it, but can also skip it, right? Hey, Jonathan, how's it going? Hey, Aaron, good to see you. So yeah, it's a game, and maybe even give your opinion. So not quite sure what you mean there, Aaron, but yes, I mean, I think you want to make sure that, you know, you understand your players really well. You understand, you know, what you're trying to achieve, you know, when you're making a game. So this kind of comes back to this topic here of what, you know, what the details are in your stories, how important they are to you. Talking about, again, the ways that you tell a story, and define those ways, define those techniques with the types of stories that you have, and try to bring those into alignment to make a better product. We talked about different types of players last week, and these different types that are commonly seen in MMOs, but can also be seen in, you know, various RPGs. Traditionally, this is more of a online player types, but I use this as just an example to show that every game has different types of players. You know, and some really want story, some don't. You know, some want to have an elaborate backstory. Some, you know, like certain things. Understand your users. Understand what kinds and how much story they want to have. And, you know, just because you love story, just because you as a designer or as a writer think this, you know, deserves the equivalent of 10,000 pages of dialogue, you know, doesn't mean you should do that, right? Like, does your users, does your consumers, do the people that want to buy this product want to hear this much story, right? And how can you, again, get to them, you know, in a more succinct way, and give them just as little story as possible, while still maybe having layers of additional stories that could be told, you know, in other ways. Then we started talking about story structure. The main takeaway, I mean, obviously, I think almost everybody here should have heard of, you know, the 3-act story structure. We talked about 9-act story structure, which is similar, a little bit more elaborate, you know, and things like that. But, you know, the beginning, the middles, and the ends, you know, are important to kind of understand. But again, I wanted to relate this back to systemic game design. And so for those of you, again, who have not seen my previous lecture on systemic game design, please go watch it, because this is a direct correlation to that. This relates more on the level design side than on the system design side, but they both are kind of intermixed. And what does that mean? Well, this means that when you start breaking down your game, when you start trying to figure out where am I going to go, when am I going to go there, what am I going to do there, who am I going to talk to, who am I going to fight, all these kinds of things start to kind of take shape naturally for a lot of games and a lot of people when you understand the systemic side of what the what's going into the game, right? And, you know, and so a lot of these things will start to sort of make sense, where, you know, like, I got to have a beginning, I got to have a middle, I got to have an end, and these things, you know, ramp up and kind of ramp down in their intensity and things like that, right? And that there's all these things that sort of have to happen, and that starts to then systemically make you go like, oh, well, I need this, and this. And then I got to fill in that blank, and I got to fill in that blank, and you start working backwards from things. And it's amazing how not that the story writes itself, but it definitely can make it a lot easier process. So again, we talked about the 9-act story structure. We talked about Joseph Campbell's mythology. We kind of blew through this pretty fast. We may have to do a few more classes on this at some point to really try to get you guys to understand how mythology is more directly, you know, in these 17 stages that Joseph Campbell goes through, you know, in a mythology for a hero character. Again, how these more directly relate to you as game designers, because this is definitely something that is important to understand. You know, and then Christopher Vogler did a good job in his book about breaking down the hero's journey and then kind of applying it into the 9-act, or in this case, the 3-act story structure, and kind of understanding where these things take place. And again, think of this as systemic game design, right? Think of this as systemic level design, right? That you know now that there's all these different points where something kind of obvious is happening, right? Now, that may not make immediate sense to you in your game and your storytelling, but these things will start to be pieces that fall into place. You also have to understand that these things have to be paced, and they need to go through cycles of, you know, being faster and slower over time. So, and then ultimately, even things like characters, we have what's called a character arc. I covered this kind of briefly last week, but keep in mind that change is good. And if you have things that are flat and static, they don't become very interesting, because we quickly learn what it is, and then we realize it's not going to ever change. And so therefore, we kind of lose interest in it. So us as human beings tend to want to see and like stories and characters and things that are maybe slightly unpredictable, or that go through these arcs of change, right? I go from being a good guy to a bad guy, maybe back to a good guy, and then, or vice versa, right? Or these characters that, go through some sort of change in their life. And that's, I think, important for us to understand as writers. And again, just understanding then like how subplots and things like that. So how do you start working in multiple layers of plots and subplots? And subplots we'll talk more about today. They're a little bit trickier, but in games, you could have 2, 3, 4 plots. You could have hundreds of plots. Now, some subplots might be a little bit more like major, meaning, these could be things that like you have to do. Like these things could be, something that's just a critical part to the entire overarching story, and you need to understand like how these all layer together in their intensities. But some subplots, might just be, you meet an old lady, her cat ran up a tree somewhere, she needs you to get it down, you've got to figure out how to get the cat out of the tree, right? It has nothing to do with the bad guys in the world, it has nothing to do with the state of the world. There's just a random subplot that happened to happen, that you can choose to help this lady or not, and then she might give you a reward that you need, or you're just doing it to be nice or earning reputation, or whatever the case is. But not every subplot has to be a critical plot, right? Not every subplot has to be something that is life and death, or means a lot to to the games. So just kind of keep that in mind, that you can have a lot of different plots that start and stop at different points. You can have a lot of plots that are getting resolved, and that some plots that are setting up the next plot. So on and so forth, right? There's not a lot of limitations, to that. So the main reason for subplots, in my opinion, or one of the main reasons, besides creating deeper, more intriguing stories and more interesting stories, that subplots, again, give you a lot of things you can set up for quests, set up for your adventures, your objectives, things like that. And so, you want to see, like, how do these make the game better? Right? How does this quest and objectives, what is that going to be a critical part of your game? Or are quest and objectives a little bit more streamlined and straightforward? Is it more just like, hey, go kill 20 bad guys? Some stuff could be a little bit more grindy, right? Especially a lot of MMORPGs are very guilty of this, or just RPGs in general. You're trying to improve your character, and so you're just like doing a lot of killing for kind of maybe no reason. And that's the way some of the subplots, might turn out. That's all the depth they have. So this was just a quick recap of last week, just to kind of get you guys, thinking about it. So let's kind of dive into the second part here and kind of try to understand, what is it, in this, in this subplot, right? And within the storytelling and within all the structure and with all this kind of systemic play, stuff, how do we now make it a better story, right? What are some other techniques and things that are useful, for that? So again, welcome everybody. Please, if you have questions, please ask. This talk's here for everybody. So I do appreciate questions. It helps me out because I don't have to think so much, and I want to make sure I'm answering, any points of confusion and stuff like that, especially today when I'm rambling a little bit. So, but again, thanks everybody for joining me. And let's, if you don't have questions, let's dive into part 2. So we kind of started talking about this last week, but really what's important to understand is that there is 3 primary ways of structuring a story. Now, in all honesty, there's hundreds of ways, and there's not a exact right or wrong answer for, for how to structure a story, right? You can be perfectly exactly linear, that your entire story can be completely and totally on a rail, right? You can have this. The second technique is a string of pearls, as they call it. And so it's you go down a path, then there's some little offshoots, and you do the offshoot, you come back. You do the offshoot, you come back. And there's little side missions, and some of this relates to how the story is structured, and some of this relates to even how the world is structured, right? So if you literally looked at this as a map, this same structure could be applied to a level. This same structure could be applied to the entirety of the game. So if you think about like all of these circular points, with the square being, your beginning, your triangle being the end, and and all these circles. If this was literally a map for a level, you could literally see how this would flow. These could be like valleys. These could be streets that you're going down that dead end, and you're exploring some different kind of areas. So this literally could almost be physical in its manifestation. However, that being said, this could be just a literal representation of how the story and plots work. And so these points here may have almost no relevance to each other physically. And so in other words, like if you come to this first point, point here, let's call it point 1, and I'm going to go to point 1A, here. Well, 1A might, in this case, be 100 meters. But point, 1B could be 100 miles, right? Or 100, whatever, 10,000 meters, some other huge distance that puts it way off here. So, these things don't have to be like physically like, oh, this is 100 meters, this is 100 meters, right? This is a representation of it like a flow chart, not an actual, reality of what these things are. But what you need to kind of understand is, especially in these endings, so you can see here that there's one start and there's one ending. So in doing this, there's a lot more, predictability, meaning I can go off and kind of do some of these side things, but I'm still going to get to the end of the game at some point, and I'm going to know as a game designer what people are going to do. And that's really important. Now, this branching paths or an open world path can get exponentially more complicated, by the minute, and you have to be really careful because you can see here that, that there's these 7 or 8, whatever, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 paths. Can't count today. And there's these 9 endings, right? And all these different paths. And so this, as a game designer, when I see this, scares me because I'm like, okay, crap, what does each of these endings have, right? Is there a different cutscene for each one of these endings? So I went from having 1 cutscene here to 9 here, right? That's 9 times, almost 10 times more work. And maybe even 10 times plus work, just because figuring out all these endings and planning for them and accounting for them and stuff like that can actually be a lot of work in and of itself. It's not just easy to write 9 trivial endings, right? And then you have to figure out the gameplay systems that allow you to work from one branching point to another, and allowing the player to have choices. And while choices are great, as we start making these different endings, it can get pretty scary, right? And just the complexity of it. Now, also one thing to keep in mind is that you need to understand your audience again. And the reason for that is that a lot of games go out of their way to make alternate endings. And the thought with many game designers is that, well, if I put in, let's just call it even we'll do 2 options to make it the simplest. Good and bad, right? If you played as a good guy or you play as a bad guy, and those each had different techniques behind them, I could get 2 different endings in the game. But as that gets more and more and more and more complicated, you've got to figure out, well, how's the player affecting those endings? Does he know that he's choosing that ending? And this is a big problem with a lot of games where you might get on a path and the path splits, but the player is never aware of it splitting. The player is making an arbitrary choice, and then that arbitrary choice leads them down a new path, but they don't even realize they went down another path. And so they don't even realize, so the designers put in all these other endings, hoping that the person would replay it and therefore get more bang for their buck, out of this project, or out of the game. That being said, though, if you're not even aware that those choices exist, or if you don't even like the first product in the first place, why are you going to replay it again, right? So you need to make sure that the people want to replay the game, and even and then even have a choice for doing it, and maybe an alternate endings. But I would say I don't remember the number exactly. I think it was in the 1% type range or area of their 1% of the players will probably replay a game just to see an alternate ending. It's very low. It's very small. They are and could be a vocal minority, which may be somebody that's good for you to deal with, and to make happy, but don't feel like putting in all these different endings is going to suddenly like give you 10 times more people that are interested in it. Only people that really, really, really love your product in the first place are going to bother to replay it again, right? So even if there's branching paths and alternate paths and all these things that just add the complexity, and so you have to kind of sometimes step back from it and go like, yeah, it'd be great to have 10 endings, but if every one of those endings cost me $1 million of production costs, let's say, suddenly now I just spent $9 million on additional endings that I didn't need to spend, and therefore the total project might sacrifice. It may be a compromise that I may not want, right? And so you really need to evaluate what is the true cost of all these branches. What's the true cost in production, new art assets, new cinematics, new game design, new scripting, on and on and on and on. How does it break the game, if the player is trying to achieve a certain level, or whatever they're trying to do, how does that mess up the game? Or does it? But trying to plan for that, trying to account for that can be really hard. And that's something you do need to be kind of aware of. So the point of this path, is kind of showing that there's all these, the player path is kind of going down the center in this particular one. But what this is kind of just showing is that they're sort of just showing the ebbs and flows of there's these areas that I can kind of go into, and there's areas that I can't. And it's just kind of showing that there's, a main path, there's different, and alternate paths, and then kind of these zones, areas, or levels that I might go into, right? So for example, in level design, I might have a single level, and I might have an entry over here and an exit over here, right? But, and I might have a couple story plot points along the way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't have the totality of this level, that I might be running around and doing stuff and fighting things and doing all these things. And at some point I'm like, okay, I'm going to progress the story plot point too. So I come over here, and then I'm going to go to number 3, and then I'm going to go randomize and go do some other stuff. Then eventually I'm going to go to story plot number 4, and so on. And I'm eventually working my way towards the exit. But, in the short time, I'm bouncing around and doing other stuff. So this is just a slightly more elaborate version of kind of the hub and spoke. What this is kind of showing, if you guys can see this okay, is that up here there's basically one, let's call each one of these a story point or even a level. Doesn't really matter, conceptually, but what this is kind of showing is that your act 1 of your story is very simple, right? It's just this one thing. And then act 2 goes into kind of these 4 things. And act 2 has, but it's a fairly kind of linear path through act 2, right? And then what it's showing is when you get into act 3 then has 3 possible different paths, that you're going to go down, right? And so at some point you're going to do all 3 of these, and then that will unlock path 4, which is then a linear, thing to the finish. And so these kinds of structures become easier for you to do, because you kind of know that, like, okay, here's, these 3 alternate paths, and the player is going to go down them, but at some point he's still going to hit kind of a finished ending, and that's what's kind of important for you to sort of understand. This is kind of another way of just kind of showing how things can be a little bit non-linear. You can see that there's an act 1, an act 2, and act 3, but there's a number of different points in here, and some of these are, where you can bypass some stuff. So there's a point here like in act 1 where I'm going to go all the way over to this detective story, and this is going to drop me down to act 3, but this totally, missed, these 2 story points here. But in the end, the last stuff still ended back at act 3, So you can see a lot of stuff is pushing you into Act 3. There's a couple ways that you can bypass that. And so, again, relatively simple, but again, a different way of structuring things. This is kind of another way of looking at it, what they call hub and spoke, where you'll move along to a center path. Games like Diablo and things like that will use kind of this type of a structure, and that quite often the spoke, as we call it, the hub, which is the center point. That center point is often a town or a base or some kind of man-made human structural place that has lots of people there, and I can talk to them, I can buy and sell things, all that kind of stuff. So I can deal with my inventory control. I can deal with getting more new quests there, and then those things start unlocking new stuff, whether those are dungeons or adventures or whatever from that. So quite often cities in these kind of more hub type locations can serve as kind of these hub and spoke models where you'll typically kind of go there and back, kind of thing. And keep in mind from a physicality standpoint, you might be looking at these as story points, right? So the story point may say like, well, I'm going to go here. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that like I literally go down this road, I come over here, I fight this bad guy, kill him, and then go down this road and come back again, right? So that's the literal interpretation of a hub and spoke, but it's not necessarily the reality of what a real hub and spoke model has to be. I might be, getting down to the end of my path, I kill the guy, and then I can teleport back, or I get flown back, or something else sort of happens, right? And so there's lots of ways that can be done, and so don't think of this as literally where I have to go there and come back along the same physical path again. That's a misconception that a lot of designers will try to do, but you want to build in either some fast travel stuff, or you want to build in something that allows you to move around the game in kind of an adequate way, right? And that's something that you need to sort of be aware of. You gonna come up and say hi? Come here. I got a new cat on Sunday, so I knew how. So we may get a guest appearance here from our guest speaker. One of these days, he's for the first time today walking around my house and come say hi. So he's a little bit scared. Only been here a few days. So, all right, we'll let him go. Anyways. Sorry, buddy. So, right now I'm calling him Dude. I don't know, D-O-O-D, kind of a play on the D-U-D-E name. So right now his name is Dude, and he's about to turn 2 years old. He's a rescue kitty. So, anyways, I haven't had a cat in many years, so excited to finally have a friend again. All right. Right. Thanks, guys. Yep, he's quite the character, but we'll see how he is. Like I said, only really kind of the first day he's been out and about, not out from under the bed. So, but he's warming up fast. Come here. He wants to come up and say hi, but he's never been up to my desk before, so this is all kind of scary for him. So again, more examples of kind of just branching paths, and you can see how they can get exponentially more complicated, right? And as game designers and as storytellers, we need to be careful. This is an area that can get exponentially worse and harder for us. We want to make these complex stories. We want to make these things that have all this depth and complexity in them because we think that's going to be more interesting. But you want to really make sure that the complexity doesn't overwhelm you as game designers, as game developers, and that their whole team really understands how the structure is and stuff. And I think, some teams like a BioWare or somebody have really mastered like how to make great dialogue and these branching stories. And they can kind of, I don't want to say that it's easy for BioWare, but they they've done it. They kind of know how to do it, right? If this is your first game and you've never done a really elaborate story and stuff like that, don't think that you can go do Mass Effect or Dragon Age or something like that, or The Witcher better than those other guys, right? You might think you do, but the complexity of how it branches out, and and the options it starts giving you, and how story changes story, which affects gameplay, those things are exponentially harder than you realize. And so just be careful there, and understand that it's not trivial. So just be a little leery of getting too complicated in your storytelling. And as you create these branching story plots, again, it feels like you'll have replayability. It feels like you're gonna the player's more in control and all these things. But again, the number of people that actually replay a game is very small. And if they don't know that they're making a choice, if they don't know that they're in there, that they're going good or bad, or yes or no, or down plot A versus B, right? Then they may get to the end and not even realize there's alternate endings and stuff. And then you got to do more work to like educate people on those types of things, right? So just be careful about that, and understand that that branching complicated storylines aren't always better, right? Think about movies and stuff. I mean, movies as a medium, and plays, and all, even books for the most part, like they're linear stories, right? Games have taken the next step, being nonlinear with them, but games are not. Games are way more complicated, right? And so even the best storytellers in Hollywood and stuff that have come and tried to work in games, a very significant amount of them have failed, and ultimately gone back to making movies, because making a linear story is just exponentially easier than making a nonlinear interactive story, right? And so I really want you guys to understand that this is a complicated thing, and don't take it lightly for how hard the production value is, for making these nonlinear games. And so we won't keep diving into this, but just kind of showing you that there's lots of, different ways of structuring it. I prefer kind of structures like this, where again, there's a beginning and there's an ending, right? And ultimately everything kind of like comes back together, and there's just different ways of doing it. Now, another technique, which you didn't really talk about before, is what we call nonlinear stories. So these would take place in, any kind of an open world game, MMORPGs or things like Grand Theft Auto and stuff like that. And the way that you kind of often think about these types of stories isn't necessarily that you have to flow from, story plot point 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, in a linear way, or it's not like some of the others where it branches off and does these things. But the way these stories are often structured is that there's lots of points in the world that have these strong stories. So you might have a really high level arc, right? But your story and your levels and stuff are designed in such a way that there's just kind of like, there's lots of little story points, right? And it doesn't matter. Let's just say that this subplot that you're in has 10 little points to it that you want to make. But do those points need to be shown, and discovered in order? In other words, do I need to go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and so on? Do I need to go from like maybe 1 to 2, or in some other some other way, right? Like how am I going to go through that world? How am I going to do that thing? And so in this particular case, in a nonlinear game, what you're kind of saying is, well, you need to do all 10 of these things, or maybe you got to do 8 out of 10 or 5 out of 10 or whatever it is at some point to progress. So let's just call this like, area A, and then kind of area B and area C, right? Each of these could have 10 points in them, but to get from like one to the next, maybe you have to unlock it. Maybe you have to do a certain amount of stuff, right? But these points, it doesn't matter, each of these points here could be, this guy gets killed here. this thing happens here. I find a treasure here. And these are all things that reinforce this overall plot. So this could be like an overall plot here, but all these things are being put together, in such a way that added together, they create the entire story, but they don't need to necessarily be done always in a linear fashion. Does that make sense? So hopefully you guys are kind of understanding that conceptually about open world games. I definitely do not recommend if you are a more junior game designer and you're new to game design. Open world is definitely by far the hardest to do. Again, at some levels it sounds easy, but from both a gameplay mechanics standpoint and from a storytelling standpoint, this is definitely advanced, very senior level work. This is not something you would want to tackle the first time you've done it. And so I caution you to be careful about, taking on open world type games if you've never done it before. And something else to kind of think about is that, in bigger games, and especially like MMORPGs, if you think about WoW or games that have massive worlds, right? One of the problems we get into in storytelling is that, and even just in creating quests and making the stories and the levels interesting, is that we just don't have time as game designers. We don't have time as storytellers. We don't have time within the production of the game to make every square inch like amazing, right? And so one of the things that you have to think about when you're designing the worlds is that if you think about this as like literally a map right now, right? You can't put little story points and story things and all this stuff that really matter. Like you just can't handcraft that necessarily. I mean, yes, occasionally your rock stars and your other companies that do games like Red Dead Redemption or stuff like that have a fairly handcrafted, quite all over the place type feel, but they're also spending, so much money that the rest of us, could never do that, right? So the reality is that you need to create these points of interest. Quite often these are story points or have something there. Now this point here, for example, might just be like this could be the woods. This could be a whole wooded area with these 3 being little outposts on the edge of the woods. This is deep in the middle of the woods. It could just be a vendor that there's a road coming through the woods, and there's a vendor along the road that's in this clearing. And when I get there, I can buy and sell some stuff, and I learn a little bit of story from him about some other region or something like that. So what you want to start off with when you're building a lot of these nonlinear stories is you're building these focal points. You're building these points in your world that are of interest. And I still think this is an important point, because whether you are building open world games or even just other types of games, this same technique is kind of needed, and to understand that you may not have the time as game designers to create handcrafted stories and quests and things like that throughout your entire map. So then what do? So you start with this. You start with these points of interest. You start with the things that are really important. You may add a few more as you go. You may find that I need an extra, quest here or an extra little story plot there. Fine, throw that in. But what's the cost there? Like, do I need a whole custom castle that goes with it? Or do I just need like a little box, right? I mean, like, at what level and what resources is going to go into crafting this unique custom story, place, and event, right? And then what you're typically wanting to do is that all this filler area, all this stuff where these points of interest are not happening, those quite often then are like randomly generated, monsters and creatures and things like that allow you to, to go and just experience things and maybe grind or level up, but they're not necessarily these super handcrafted, boss fights and story points and cutscenes and all these things that are really expensive to put together. So again, the point I'm getting to a lot of this stuff is that a lot of your decisions here really affect the production, in a significant way. And this is something you have to be really careful of, because it's really, really, really easy for your story to get blown out of proportion. And so back to kind of where we talked about at the beginning today, that there's all these different types and ways and techniques that I can tell story. But that doesn't mean that I want to, if I'm making a 20-hour game that's fairly sizable, or something like 40 hours like The Witcher or something, like I may not have the budget to go put several hours of cutscenes into that game, right? I may want to have the equivalent of 2-3 hours of these cutscenes, but that could cost millions of dollars, to do, so especially if it was pre-rendered. So how I tell the stories, the amount of story I tell, all these things have really huge, significant impact on your budgets, on your schedules, and those things. And so I'm trying to kind of caution you guys, both in wanting you to learn what's best, but in the same hand, be careful, because I do see a significant number of people get overblown, overboard with just how much they try to create. Now, we've kind of covered this in the branching narratives already, but I just want to reinforce that you start with the base, you go into some conflict happens, then you go into resolutions, right? Meaning that everything has to resolve itself in some way, shape, or form. This could be getting the cat out of the tree. This could be killing a bad guy, a boss, a sub-boss. This could be destroying a building. This could be helping somebody. Whatever these things are, but we need resolution in our stories, and we need conflict in our stories. And so we're going to get more into this as we talk a little bit more today about this cycle of conflict and action, and understanding that you want to keep constantly, if you're making a great story, and especially if you're creating a world building universe that goes way beyond just that particular project, you need to understand that conflict can be something that is very much ongoing, and could go on literally for the life cycle of the product for years and years and years, not just for the couple of hours you're going to play this particular game. And so are you setting up the right conflict? Are you setting up the right resolutions? Are you resolving things too much, or are you leaving things open, right? So you have to also be careful to not be overly resolute, meaning I used this example before. I like to call it the Highlander syndrome. That's my own name for it, but the movie Highlander. And I mentioned this, I think, in the earlier talk, where the original movie Highlander was done. It was made. At the very end, everybody wins, and the story resolves itself completely. But then the story was successful enough, they wanted to make sequels, and they literally had to contrive a huge horrible story, and the sequels are just painfully bad, because everybody resolved, the story resolved itself without understanding that more sequels might be wanted, right? Or more stories might be needed, and they didn't leave themselves an opening, and so that's part of what resolutions are good for, but resolutions also often will generate more conflict, and so if you want to be a masterful storyteller, you're going to be constantly setting up new conflicts, and they're staggered, right? So, I mean, this picture is showing everything kind of resolving, here equally. But in reality, what you really want is a whole bunch of staggered, conflicts, action, and resolutions, right? So some things are resolving, but then that resolution leads to something else, So another example I gave last week was this idea of if you think about a city, and you think about a modern day city, and you think about the gangs that are in it, right? Me as a player, let's say I'm playing the role of a cop in this game, right? And I'm going to go into this thing, and I'm going to be the toughest anti-drug, anti-whatever thing there. I go after this gang, whether it's for revenge or however I want to go after them, right? I go after them, and then and then part of the problem could be that I wipe out the gang, right? So now what naturally happens in any urban environment? I mean, that void may last for a little tiny bit, but ultimately, when there's a void in power, all these external groups suddenly get sucked into it, right? Because it's they all want more power. That's the nature of people that are bad. It's the nature of criminals, the nature of warlords, the nature of many leaders, throughout history, right? Is that we're always looking, if we see an easy target, if we see something that's there that we're God, I can go take that over and go make a bunch of money or get more power, get more fame, whatever that thing is, we will naturally attempt to try to do that. If we're a bad guy, right? But I would argue even perceived good governments do the same thing, right? England expanding out in its expansionistic, eras in the 1600s and whatever. Was that good or bad? That's a judgment that I'm not going to try and make, but was, England coming over to America, going to India, not Canada, but Australia, places like that, right? England expanded out and created all this stuff around the world, right? And with that brought a lot of good, but they also did a lot of bad, right? And so sometimes this stuff's a little subjective, right? So as storytellers, but we're establishing these things. We're establishing the power structures. We're establishing the politics. We're establishing all these things as we build our stories, so that this becomes a natural thing. So the player may feel like hey, I'm making progress. I'm getting through this game. I'm taking out this gang, and then boom, like I take out the gang, and I think like I'm proud. Like I took out this gang. Like I made a bunch of people's days. I helped a bunch of people, and you think that you did good in the world, right? And you did for a minute. But the problem is it created a vacuum. Now, one set of bad guys may not be as equal as another set of bad guys. So, like this set of bad guys, kind of bad. This set of bad guys can be like horribly bad, right? Like these are the kinds of guys that are gonna, kill everybody and take names later. These are the guys that kind of like, yeah, we sell drugs, but like we're actually kind of nice to the community type bad guys, right? And so even the concept of a villain, the concept of a bad guy, there can be some small bad guys, all the way to like the really big bad bosses to just really horrific types, right? And so in the player doing something, what he feels is good, he may open a void that allows an even worse person to come in, right? And so on and so forth. But you can establish that. You can foreshadow that. You can kind of have some dealings there, and the player's there to try to do some good. But now once that one thing goes away, suddenly the next one replaces it, right? And then the next one, and that could go on for several cycles. And so whether that's in the course of a single game, like every level, could be like, hey, go take out these guys, and you do your thing, and you bust this gang, you're saving the city. Then somebody bigger comes in and takes over that whole area, right? So suddenly now I got an even more powerful boss to deal with, right? So these are how these conflicts and these resolutions really have to kind of work together, right? If you guys remember the old TV show Babylon 5, and the sister to it was Star Trek Deep Space Nine. If you guys don't know, those were both based on the originals. Both were based on the same script. One was optioned, and then ultimately the option ran out. And long story, somebody created another script, but both the scripts were kind of based on the original Babylon 5. And it's a long story, but they both those scripts were actually based on the same original scripts. If you have seen both Babylon 5 and Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the space station that sits in the middle by this wormhole, this whole thing, like you can see a lot of similarities in the scripts. One of the things that was very interesting in those TV shows, and a friend of mine, J. Michael Straczynski, or Joe, was the creator of Babylon 5 and the writer, for it. And what was very fascinating, what Joe did, is that he created all the story arcs for the entire 5 years of episodes. And so, we're talking, 22 episodes per year back in the day when they had real seasons and not these wimpy 10 episode or whatever it is, 6 episode things that drive me crazy now, where you barely even get into these seasons and then they're over, it seems like. And so, the storylines were written for about 5 years across the board, and so he really knew where the whole plots were going to go. And so when you started watching it, at the end of every season, there was always resolution. Some bad guy, some major villain, some major thing got defeated, but he'd already kind of set up like there was something new kind of happening. There was something worse happening. There was something different happening, and that thing, one thing led to another, and then ultimately that next thing shifted for the next season to create new types of interest and new types of stuff. And so whether you're doing those as like game 1, game 2, game 3, game 4, instead of season 1, season 2, season 3 kind of thing, or whether you're doing it as like area 1, area 2, area 3, area 4 within the same game, right? However you're structuring your world building, you have to think about that players also want variety, right? And they want to know that these things naturally go there. And if you just kind of do the Highlander thing where you're like, oh, this thing resolved, it ended, and then suddenly like, oh, next, and the next thing happens, and you're like, that made no sense. Like, why did that happen? I have no idea, because it came out of the blue, right? And suddenly it's like just something random happened, and yes, you can do that, but it's not going to make a great story, right? It's so you want to be setting up these conflicts and resolutions, and I think this is one of the hardest things to do in world building. And so I'm overemphasizing this today because this idea of conflict, action, and suspense, and kind of constantly building these things in when you're world building, especially, I mean, it's hard enough in a single product. If you expand this out to multiple products, multiple things, it's really, really hard to be thinking about what are all the bosses and sub bosses and enemies and different types of different types of enemies and different types of things that may be coming in and causing conflict, right? Who are these people, aliens, creatures, demonic spirits, whatever it is, and then over time does that shift and does that change, right? Does that is it always the same bad guy year after year after year, or does it ebb and flow, right? And generally we want to have some shift and some changes because we get bored, right? Human beings tend to get bored, and so if we're always fighting the same sets of bad guys and the same things, whatever, after a while we're kind of like, okay, been there, done that, right? But fighting, different types of enemies, different types of things with different weapons can be a way for you to add gameplay into your world and stuff. And so, whether it's in a region again, or whether it's a game, or whether it's whatever you're trying to do, you can create a lot of variety in your worlds, and in your universes, and in, across your products and whatever it is, by having a different variety of things, but by keeping in mind that if it's just like one gang versus another, and if this is the equivalent like in today, if the Bloods and the Crips, right? I know they're different, and I know they're there, but for all intents and purposes, from a layman's perspective, I see them as the same thing. They're two sides of the same coin, right? There's a bunch of guys. They got machine guns. They're doing drugs and fighting over territory, and they're basically these two competing entities that basically do the exact same thing. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but the way that you would deal with the Bloods and the Crips if you were a cop is basically kind of the same. The types of fights that you would have with them, the types of things that would build into your world and story, yes, are a little bit different. And yes, you could differentiate some of that, but it's harder, right? Because when two things are very, very similar, trying to be like, okay, well, these guys, how do I differentiate their gameplay, their stories? How do I make them, more empathetic or sympathetic or more evil or whatever? In my plot lines is a lot harder versus an extreme example would be something where I could be a cop and I'm on the ground and I'm dealing with, say, this gang war between the Bloods and the Crips. And so, part one of my story is me dealing with this. And we think like, okay, like cool, like basic battles, basic tension, basic conflict. And then suddenly aliens attack, right? So suddenly now I'm stuck in the middle of a gang war while the aliens are attacking. And now maybe the gang members have to become my friends. Maybe I got to befriend the gang members to help fight against the aliens, right? So that could completely shift, and change things up from a storytelling perspective, right? So think about stuff like that. Think about ways that you can add, contrasting stuff, more so than just things that are homogeneous and more similar to each other, right? If that makes sense. Stop for a quick question. So to answer your question about how much the game designer makes in the U.S., it's an impossibly hard story. There's so many variables between how much experience you have and the types of companies you work on, the types of projects you work on, total compensation and stuff like that. So I really can't give you a solid answer. Gamasutra.com and the GDC.com both have done salary surveys. I would recommend going there and checking those out because I don't want to misquote those things. Junior level type designers can be $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year. Mid to junior levels can be $70,000, $80,000, $100,000. Senior lead creative directors can make $150,000, $200,000 or even more. And so there's this massive difference of salaries, across the industry. Not always rhyme or reason to them. Salaries in the U.S. also will vary a lot by region. So California, San Francisco, L.A., significantly higher. Seattle, fairly high. But Austin and other places are a little bit lower. There's reasons that game teams go there. But if you look at cost of living adjustments, you might make, if you're making $50,000 a year in Dallas, Texas, or in Texas or something, you would have to make, I'm pulling a random number right now, but just like $80,000 a year, say in California, to have the same lifestyle, right? So the base number in the States especially, is not necessarily what you want to look at when you're looking at jobs. As a game designer, you really want to look at, like, what's the lifestyle you want to live, right? What's going to make you happy? What's going to give you those things you need? Do you want to live in a big city? Do you want to live in a small city, right? And what kinds of people do you want around you? Do you want to be in Texas? Do you want to be in Canada, or do you want to be in Colorado, or somewhere more rural, somewhere bigger? And does that make you and your family happy? And those kinds of things are sometimes more important than just chasing the top dollar, right? And so you have to kind of be careful about that. But again, salaries are way all over the board. And again, there's not really a rhyme or reason to what people want, right? I've just seen kind of things at all extents, all purposes. So sorry I can't help you there, but again, if you search for game designer salary survey on Google, and either like on Gamasutra, GDC, or some other sites have those, they have pretty detailed salary surveys. And for those of you who aren't designers, those salary surveys are pretty good. They have artists, programmers, producers, all kinds of different people are listed there in those salary surveys. So, and I do believe that they have worldwide numbers and kind of do a lot of comparison around the world for what different salaries are. But everyone, please keep in mind, you do this because you love it. Do it because you want to. I encourage you not to chase just top dollar, because that isn't necessarily going to make your quality of life better, right? And so just kind of be aware of that. Also, working for big companies versus small companies. A bigger company may pay you top dollar, but you may be working 80 hours, 100 hours a week. Be working much harder. You might be having a lot more politics and other kinds of things. So keep in mind that sometimes that dream of going to work for a really big company or something may not fit your personality, may not fit who you are, and not be something that makes you happy, right? And so just be aware of that sometimes just being a more junior person at a small little indie company, you may make half as much money, but if you're doing it and you're loving your job, you love the people you're with, you like the projects, and you're happy, right? And don't underestimate that. And that's a little bit of advice coming from a guy that's, a lot of my career I chased money, and I did make really good money, and I went up the corporate ladder, to the highest levels. But in all honesty, I really wish I'd just stayed a game designer, like a lead designer or something. The job that I had 20 years ago, I probably liked better, and I made, a lot less money, but I was happier, so I, in all honesty, don't necessarily think that having a big executive title and a big executive job with more money is going to make you any happier, right? It just, your problems get different, not better, right? So keep that in mind. So, Malin, how much time do game designers spend in engines versus prototyping on paper? Tough question, because every company, every project, every studio is a little bit different. And so, like in my course, I teach a lot more theory, although we are now working in a full regiment to teach Unreal. But part of the problem is that, some games and some teams don't have their own engines. And so you literally can't even get into your engine for a while, right? I've had this on many, many projects where, for the first year, like I couldn't even get in and build anything in the engine if I wanted to, right? So I was literally just stuck paper prototyping because I didn't have, the team was not using Unity or Unreal. We were building our own custom solution, and therefore, I had to wait for not only the engine to be finished, but all my level tools and everything else to get working, and it was super annoying. And that was just the way that a lot of teams work. And these days, about 30% of the teams roughly use Unity, 30% Unreal, and roughly 30% roll their own, and about 10%, are all of the other engines like Amazon Lumberyard or things like that. So it's really difficult, because again, every team, every project's a little bit different, and the amount and how quickly you can get into, the engine is important. But you also have to remember that you need to figure out what's going into, say, a level, what's going into what you're building, and have you designed it first, or are you just jumping in and just building haphazardly? And so I'm a really, really big believer in designing on paper first. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go to paper prototype, but at least, say if you're doing level design, you want to go in and at least get word descriptions of what you're going to build, and then you're going to go in there and figure out, the rough stories. You're going to figure out the plot points. You're going to figure out, a rough map, and on paper, things like that. So kind of what you're building. Then go build it in 3D, right? And go or whatever engine you're going to build it in, and things like that. So you can move very quickly. Same thing with gameplay mechanics and prototyping on paper. There, some games you can prototype almost everything on paper. Some games you can't almost prototype anything. Some of it's just very touchy-feely, and you got to get it in there. So, the system mechanic type people, how you run, how you jump, how you touchy-feely, and shoot and all these things, you got to feel that, right? And so you can paper prototype that a little bit, but that kind of stuff needs to get quicker into the engine, usually with rapid prototyping and stuff. And then that way you can just keep going and iterating on it over and over and over again. But don't assume that, that there is a right answer, and don't assume that even if you do it once one way, that it's going to be the same the next time, because again, just everything's got little nuances there. And so in the end, experience will kind of lead you towards what the right thing to do is. But I would say that if you try to jump into building it too quickly, you're definitely going to hit a wall. And if you jump, but if you spend too much time paper prototyping, you could also be wasting time. And so somewhere in the middle is kind of that balance, at least from my experience. And again, it really just depends on what your team does, what your company culture is. A lot of those factors have a lot to do with what the final answer also is going to be. So hopefully that helps you. Let's see here. So again, we talked about this. I'm not going to dwell on multiple endings, but again, keep in mind that of course, Malin. Keep in mind that again, the more complicated multiple endings get, it forces you to have a lot of extra work, especially late in the game, that ultimately very few people are going to see. So would you rather have these types of endings, multiple endings, or would you rather have, just a more highly polished, bigger game experience, right? And so you have to kind of understand where these things are. Another example of this, we have to be careful. There's a game, and I'll not say names today just to protect the guilty, I guess, or whatever. But there's a game that I was partially involved in a little bit. And they spent a lot of work. The game was kind of initially very linear. And then at one point, you're basically being told by a commander. It was an action game, spy game, and you're basically being told constantly, like, do this, do this, do this, do this. And that's the way game designers have taught game players over the years. That typically you have some voice on a radio to some text or people we talk to or whatever. And they tell us to do something, and we do it. So in this particular game, 3/4 of the game was linear for the most part. Like you're basically had to follow this path, and you were constantly being told, kill this person, do this thing. And so the players were doing that. And then at one point they decided that it would be cool that you would have a choice of kill this person or not kill this person, and then that would branch the storyline and have multiple endings. And again, this is like 3/4 of the way through the game, but the players never knew that they had that choice. The players were never told they had that choice. And none of the players even knew that they had that choice. So, of course, like 95% of the people just killed the person because that's what they were told to do, not realizing they actually had a choice to not kill the person, and they could have then been more moral and gotten this extra morality thing of like, well, you didn't actually kill that person, blah, 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 and it branched the plot line. But that team spent a tremendous amount of time getting that alternative path there that, a few percentage of people even saw. So unless you're the type that was going to go on Google and like look up hints and things like that, like you would have never, ever, ever known whether you chose to kill him or to save him. You would have never known that other option existed, And so it's like, do you really want to put in that much effort into branching storylines? And if you do, make sure that people know. Make sure that you somehow foreshadow, allude, tell them that they got a choice. Literally come out and say, like, you can kill him or not. Like, it's your choice or whatever it is. But make sure that they understand that they have these choices, right? Because that's something that's kind of important for them to do. No, man, it's not Fallout. But I think there was a similar plot line in Fallout that they did something similar. But it's a problem, right? Because we're giving players the illusion of these choices. But if you don't even know the choice exists, then like, why even give them the choice at all in the first place, right? So some of these choices are kind of like don't have meaning, right? Because the players just never knew. It's not like real life, right? Where I can wake up tomorrow and decide like, oh, I'm gonna go to work or not go to work, right? And if I don't go to work, I'm probably gonna get fired, and then I'm in trouble, and then I don't have money, and then I can't buy food, and like I can think through the ramifications if I don't go to work tomorrow, right? And if I get fired. But in the same hand, if I don't even know if I get to stay home or not, I'm just told get up in the morning and go to work, and I'm a sheep. I'm going to go do that. Going to work. Okay, I know I'm doing that. But like, do I want to set up all these ramifications if I don't go to work and I get fired? And then what happens, right? Do I have to get a new job? Like, what do I do? So it's those kind of things that you have to make it really clear to players, like what that means. So the next topic I want to talk about is using story to expand your universe. Now, what this kind of means, and I've talked a little bit about this in world building in the past, in the past few weeks. This is this idea that the world itself, the universe, whatever you're building, right? And keep in mind when I'm talking about world building, right? This could be, your entire world, as we call it. So again, I'm using the world, the name world, figuratively, right? So keep this in mind when we talk about world building. We're talking about building the place, the location, and the things that the player or viewer or user experiences. So that could be like the entirety of that experience could take place in one room. Like it doesn't have to be literally planet Earth, right? So when we say world building, we're not literally saying you have to build the planet Earth or you have to build planet XYZ, that you're, building the next Star Wars movie, or Star Trek, and you're creating some literally whole new world from scratch. That is the epitome of things. That's like the biggest of the big of the big. Like I gotta create, look at what James Cameron did in Avatar, right? And the Na'vi language, and and if you guys have never studied and looked into what Jim did for Avatar, it is absolutely mind blowing the amount of work that Jim put into building that new planet, the new culture, the new alien race, the language that they have. Everything was, years and years and years of work. And so if you're at all fascinated about world building and stuff, there is a bunch of articles and I think even some books and stuff that have been written about just, all the stuff that Jim went into before he even wrote the scripts, just in his world building. So understand that, yes, world building can be that complex. Like world building can literally be the James Camerons, type people, who are building out an entirely new civilization, right? And lots of sci-fi and fantasy writers do this all the time. This is their job to build these new fascinating worlds. And maybe the entire planet exists, but, and this whole planet could be a whole new alien planet. But I might only, go onto the planet, like think about Star Trek or something, right? They beam down to a little city. They beam down to a little something somewhere, and and they probably don't go more than a few hundred meters, or at least a few kilometers away. They stay in that one little area they beam down in, and maybe occasionally they go to another location there. But really, like the entire planet exists, and their world is just that one little thing, that one little place, that's there, right? And they deal with the people in that little town or in that little thing. And so when we're world building, we're building out what people know, right? But while that's really exciting and that's really fun, I don't care, again, whether you're building out, a single room that you're trapped in, or you're building out an entire universe, right? This is all world building, right? But what this is really about and what we're talking about today is that the world, as we're saying the experience, the stories, the area, the locations and things that the player, let's just assume it's a game for now, that the player is going to experience in the course of this particular project is better if it's bigger, right? So we may only experience this little small thing here, right? This is our world for the game. We don't travel outside of it. We don't need to go outside of it. everything is kind of relevant to this, and whether that's a planet or whether that's just, a few square city blocks or whatever that thing is, that's our world. But what makes it more important, or what can make it more interesting, is understanding that there is context, that the universe can be bigger, right? So I may only experience this, but this other big thing exists around me, right? So one example I use a lot is The Walking Dead. So The Walking Dead, if you guys have seen, especially just go back to the original Walking Dead, season 1, roughly Atlanta, Georgia. We know it's somewhere kind of in that area, and the zombie apocalypse happens. And basically, these characters throughout the season are maybe either trapped in some kind of a base. Maybe they've built up a little city, they fortified it, and they're fending off zombies. Or maybe it's a travel story where we're traveling through a world trying to get from point A to point B. And so our world is kind of this linear path, right? Now, what do we know about the rest of the world? Like, what's happening in Europe? What's happening in Africa? What's happening in Australia? We don't know, right? But we do know that the world is a bigger place. And so The Walking Dead slowly keeps revealing, and they've done this through some of their spinoff shows and other techniques, but they're expanding their universe to slowly keep it interesting, to slowly give you hints about what the rest of the world is going through, right? And so for me personally, it's cool because I get to see these little glimpses. It doesn't have to be this massive dialogue. We don't have to do, hours and hours and hours of monologue of, well, in Europe, blah, 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 blah is happening. Like, no, it could just be a quick little news report. It could be a little bit of a hint. I can meet a new character that's passing through that gives me a little bit of a news story, or gives me, something they found or something that was from there. It could be some rumors and news, like an old, looping radio signal or whatever that is. Or I'm talking to somebody on the radio. There's lots and lots and lots of these techniques that we can use to expand our universe. But that doesn't mean that this has to be expanding the universe that the player plays in and experiences. It's about expanding the universe and for what it is. And that's what we're trying to really do, right? Is that we're trying to make this world feel bigger. We're trying to make this whole, universe feel bigger. And part of the reason we're doing that is to just make the player feel like he's part of something bigger, right? And so there's part of that makes it feel like, oh, wow, like I'm just in this one little thing, but this whole thing is happening on a much bigger scale, right? And that's a little bit of interest. But it's also something where that can be a core tool for us when we're trying to world build, and to go like, well, where do we take future levels? Where do we take future games? Where do we take future movies, stories, whatever? And so by sort of alluding that there's more out there, or directly showing that there's more out there, by setting up little bits of mystery and these little bits of things, even though we may not experience that ourselves, it makes not only the universe richer, but potentially gives us places and things to use in future stories in different ways to, again, just make the universe keep continuing. Like we talked about a little bit ago, where you need to have lots of different layers of enemies. We have to have different conflict that's going on, different resolutions, right? And so in the same way that The Walking Dead or a show like that doesn't stay, like they don't stay in one place all the time. Like they may get to a city and think they're kind of safe, or a little town or a base, and they fortify it and they put up their walls, and they might be there for a season. But at some point, something bad's going to happen. Like the bad guys show up, the zombies show up, something's going to show up, and something's going to happen, and it's going to force them to move and get on to the next location that changes things up with a new environment, new scenarios, new bad guys, right? But they allude to that over and over and over again. They will come across somebody that's maybe had a bad dealing with some bad guy like Nealon, or somebody who's one of the bad guys for a while and things. So I mean, you can foreshadow and allude that, and then maybe that comes back a few episodes later, a few weeks later, a few years later. But those things, they built the foundation for these problems, and then they eventually kind of deal with them. So Malin, if a game or a movie has good world building, I'm already sold. Yep. So it is true that world building does have a lot to do with just how attractive your product is to the market. And And the reason we're talking about world building the way we are is to help you see that it goes beyond just making a game, right? We are making, in the perfect world, if we have the time, we are building universes, we are building these worlds, we are building these big things that exist in a much bigger way than what our product, meaning that particular game or that movie or that TV show, is building, right? And so story is one probably cheap way, or can be a cheap way, to tell and make a universe feel bigger, feel richer, feel more exciting, feel more dangerous, and add a lot of intrigue and things. Usually or it can be, again, depending on the techniques for how you're telling story. If it's just some dialogue, if it's something I read, a little bit of a newspaper clipping, whatever, those things can add a lot of value, but have very low production cost. And so to me, it's always about bang for our buck, right? Like what can I do in the game, to make the world feel bigger, to make the player feel more special, to make him understand what he's doing, why he's going through what he's going through. All those kinds of things will make the experience a lot better. And some of that can be really cheap to do. And so these expanding the universe ideas, are just ways to kind of, and there's probably 100 or 1,000 more, right? It could be a billboard, whether that's currently active or that it's old. If I'm in a new place and I see, a big giant billboard, that could be 20 years old, maybe it's post-apocalyptic zombies again, and I see a big billboard up there. It could be, something political and tells us about the state of the world. It could be something about the virus or something that was informational. It could be something as simple as like, an advertisement for a gun store. And you're like, ooh, there's a gun store. Like, hint, hint. Like, and what street is that on? Oh, okay. Like, now I know where the gun store is and I may want to go visit there, right? So you don't have to go out of your way and say like, hey guys, like, obviously you need a gun, you need some ammo, you got to protect yourself, you're dangerous. Like, why don't you go down to the gun store, right? Like, that's an obvious way of saying it. But you could see an advertisement up on a billboard and go like, oh, okay, maybe that's where I should go, right? And then if the player doesn't go there, maybe that shows up as a quest later. Or, there could be more direct or indirect routes. Somebody can say like, hey, I was just down, I found this gun store and it's packed full of stuff, but it's full of zombies and I can't get in by myself, so I need your help, right? And stuff. And so that would be a more direct storytelling thing where a character literally asks for help, in the story there, and then there's a whole subplot around, me getting the guns and maybe something bad happens and, all that kind of stuff, right? So there could be plots within subplots that are happening there around that, or it could just be something that I'm picking up on these subtle clues, these subtle hints, and I'm building a better story, and giving the player some choices, through that, right? So for all of your artists out there and for all of you game designers out there, there is a tremendous amount of overlap between art, and I'm talking about pictures and literally art, and writing and storytelling. Because as you keep hearing me say, like writing is just the tip of the iceberg. Writing words, whether that's a book that I'm literally going to open up in the game and like read words, whether that's dialogue that I'm reading or voiceover that I'm hearing in a conversation with another character or whatever, words are a common way for us to tell stories, right? But, I think there is a tremendous amount of, again, I've talked about this last week a lot, but that old adage of, pictures worth 1,000 words. And it's really true. And there's lots and lots of ways that your art can tell stories. And whether the designer designs the piece of art, at least conceptually, not to say that he's drawing it, right? But he may tell you, like, I want this, this, and this here in this location because I need it to kind of reinforce there was a battle. Or I need this, this, and this here, because I need this to be some puzzle clues and hints and stuff. Or I need this character to be big and strong and bulky and armored, because he needs to have these abilities, right? So there's that kind of stuff is going to be, there's lots and lots and lots of layers that you're going to get into in telling story. So, the design and the stuff of things, like think about even architecture, right? if I'm going to, let's just say, an alien planet, but it even could be in the US, and I go into a location and I see the kind of art and the style of the architecture that's there. How does architecture tell story? If you think about that, like the art and architecture and, could be, like a bunch of warehouses, for example, right? So if I have a whole bunch of warehouses, and I'm walking through an industrial area, like that's telling me a story, right? I'm not in the suburbs. I'm like in this, industrial area, and therefore I might be expecting certain types of things to happen. But if I'm, in some, projects area, and we'll call them suburbs, but, for lower class people and whatever, I may be seeing a lot of gangs. I may be seeing drug dealers. I may be seeing that. And I have a certain expectation because the architecture is old and run down. The same thing if I'm in favela in Brazil or something like that, right? I'm going to be on edge if I'm in a place that I know might have a lot of crime. But just the architecture of the buildings, without even seeing a single person, can tell me that. The same thing if I'm walking down the street and I'm seeing movie stars in their big mansions and these palatial estates or whatever it is, like, okay, then that's going to have another type of feeling, right? So architecture alone can tell a lot of story. Does this thing have, are these things very old? Are they new? Are they, Greco-Roman type style and have a lot of, where you could tell they were very expensive? Or were they cheap? Are they kept up? Are they run down? You can tell a lot by that. Like even my last trip to Greece a few years ago, I was so surprised because Greece is so nice, in so many places. But I was going to some of the cities right when they were hitting a lot of their biggest economic downturn, times, and like every building was just covered in graffiti and was just the none of the landscaping was kept up. Everything was just thrashed. There was trash everywhere, and stuff. And so here was this country that wasn't like, I wasn't in a city where I would feel like I would have normally felt unsafe. But the fact that it was so run down really said a lot about what was going on economically. It told a lot about what was going on kind of in the government. There was all these like political things that were spray painted everywhere and posters up, and all these kinds of things. So here was a city that probably just a couple years before was a really nice place, touristy, really nice buildings and stuff. And yet just how it had gotten run down and whatever, even in real life, like it kind of was sad. It was kind of like, it was a weird place to be. But that was through the architecture, right? That wasn't talking to people. That wasn't whatever. It was just like you could see for yourself that this place was in trouble. You could see for yourself stuff was happening, right? Now layer on another layer of adding things, events, people, that are often triggering these things. So now take that same location, right? Now start putting some buildings on fire. Start putting some people rioting. Start, putting some cops, are wearing riot gear when they're blocking off roads, and the military is coming in, and and people are gathering in groups and yelling and screaming and stuff like that. So suddenly now that's still art, right? That's things that we're building. That's people that we're building. That's characters we're animating. How are they dressed? How are they looking? How are they talking? How are they behaving, right? So now that reinforces the architecture. And just like we've seen, in real life, it doesn't take very long. I mean, sometimes hours or minutes to go from, a place that's kind of nice to just completely like, riots start happening and bad things like start happening, right? In places, suddenly businesses are boarding themselves up. We saw this last year with Black Lives Matters and a lot of the protests that were going on, even here in the Bay Area around me. And it was like, suddenly got kind of scary. And you're like, you're hearing gunfire and you're seeing people rioting on the news. And I'm looking on the news and going like, there were several times where I saw some of these really bad riots. And I literally recognized like that was my girlfriend's house in the video, that the rioters were walking by. And it was like, it really like struck home of like, ooh, like that's not good, right? Seeing, in Seattle, the Black Lives Matters people taking over like the police stations, things like that. That told a strong story. There was a lot going on there in that one thing. That was real life, right? But why can't we use those same types of storytelling mechanics when we are telling our stories, right? What types of places got attacked? What types of places are new and pristine? What types of places are run down? All that story, right? All that is atmosphere. It's the mood. It's the environment, and then it could go even deeper. Like it's nighttime and it's kind of scary. It's foggy. There could be weird fogs, and we're not even like making this thing about aliens and other kinds of creepy stuff that could get in there, and demons, and who knows what could start even taking us even farther and farther and farther, right? But what are these things that are there, and how do we use those to use that as part of our art, to show that these things could be, old or new or whatever, and they make the world a more interesting place, right? And don't forget that there's a lot of stereotypes out there. Now, stereotypes can be good and bad, but you can also call them archetypes, right? So stereotype, archetype, two sides of the same coin, right? But keep in mind that no matter what we do, that our emotions, our characters as human beings are affected by our stories, are often that way because we know and we have inherent senses for kind of the way things should be, right? And so yes, it can be a stereotype, but if I see a person that's dressed a certain way, and it's nighttime and they're acting kind of shifty, I'm going to naturally get a little bit scared, right? They don't have to say a word. They don't have to even do anything overtly hostile against me. But if I set up the atmosphere right, if I set up this thing there and I use stereotypes, that can really reinforce what people think. But keep in mind that one person's stereotype can be completely and totally different than somebody else's, right? The stereotypes of what we think, if we live in the Bay Area or a bigger city like Oakland or something here, and how we would think about, certain people or certain types of things or certain situations could be totally opposite if we go to another country, right? Or if we go to another part of even the U.S. and you go to Iowa, whatever, and their stereotypes and what they think of people could be, very different. That can also change over time. Time, meaning, what year is it? How progressive is it? I mean, think about how people have changed over time and how our societies, our governments, our differences towards women and minorities and, and people who are foreigners and all these things like ebb and flow over time, and so some of that can put a big impact into our stories, right? And so these are all things that art is going to show off, right? Am I making a game set in the 80s? Am I making a game set in the year 2100 or whatever, right? When we do these things, when the art puts us into a certain mood, the art puts us into a certain place in a certain location, it tells a certain story, and that's the kind of stuff that we as storytellers and as game designers need to work with our artists and work with our team to really try to build that out in a better, stronger way, right? So we started to talk about events a little bit. Events can really be a lot of telling you like what's going on in your story, right? So what's an event? It could be anything from, a battle, that's happening, a fight that's happening. This can be easier and more stereotypical if it's historical. So a historical event, you might know what's coming. If you're doing a World War II game and you're in a certain, battle or whatever, and you have a little bit of knowledge, you may know like, okay, the Germans are going to come across that bridge sometime soon because that's what really happened. And that's an event, right? And that thing could happen. It could be completely out of the blue. We may not know that's there. We may be doing something and then suddenly this helicopter flies by and shoots everybody, or an attack happens that we weren't prepared for, right? Or, even just, something as mundane as a packet. I'm at home talking to my wife and family and a package is delivered, and that package could have something good or bad in it, right? And that event, just that one mundane thing could set me down a journey of discovery, could send me down, some other sort of path, right? And so all these events, these are things that happen in the world, and these are really some of the more powerful ways for us to tell stories, because it's telling stories really through action, right? It's telling stories, through these series of events, that are happening, and it's more interactive, and it can be a stronger thing that helps us kind of remember, what these things are, a lot longer, right? And so you need to understand in these events, like, how's that affecting the world itself, right? So is this something like 9/11, and a terrorist planes, or these planes, controlled by the terrorists, slamming into these buildings, like the entire world was affected in some way, shape, or form, even if it was just emotional affection, even myself that was half on the other side of the United States, was terrified and horrified and scared, and every kind of emotion going through me at that time, on that day, and it's a day I'll never forget. But that's nothing in comparison to, one, the poor people that died, the first responders or other people that went in there to try to save everybody, and whether you lived or died through that. If you were in New York, you were never probably the same again, right? And so that event, like, really changed a lot of people, right? And so we can't underestimate the power of these events and these actions, especially if we build them up in our stories and we build up and we see the consequences of these things, right? We don't want to just have an event happen. Like, if the terrorist plane hits a building and the building explodes and we just see the explosion and we see the building collapse, like, yes, that scares us. That can terrify us. We can use our imagination. But what really sets us as, if it's a story, what really sets it apart, what really makes that a truly horrific thing? Yes, inherently deep down, we're going to know, like, people died. And you can say 3,000 people died, or however many, happened in this event. Yes, that is horrific. But what really brings it home is, like, seeing the people, seeing the stories, hearing about them. It's not just that they died, right? It's seeing that could have happened to you. Maybe it happened to a friend, and stuff. We see the videos and the pictures of 9/11, of people jumping out of buildings just because they'd rather die in a fall than be burned to death. Just these absolutely beyond horrific scenes, and that stuff sat with me longer than just knowing, like, 3,000 people died, because that's more abstract, right? It's more like war and those kinds of things. You can say that this really bad event happened, but putting the player into that event, putting that player into and making him care about and understand that, the empathetic nature of humans is to sympathize with those people that we're going to see there. If we see people that are in pain, they're in dying, they're sick, and hurting, that tears at us a lot more than just, being told, like, yeah, 3,000 people died today at the Twin Towers, right? Like, that is bad, but it didn't drive home the emotional connection that story can give us, right? And so these events can be the most powerful tools you have to really, make sure that the people get the idea and understand what this thing is, right? So understand that, that these events can be done in just, a lot of different ways. Now, conflict is something we've been talking about throughout today. And again, you have to understand that conflict happens in a lot of different ways. Conflict is going to happen, inherently, whether you are making a action game, whether your game has a weapon in it, a gun in it, or you can kill anybody or not. Conflict does not mean that you're fighting, right? In the sense that physically, whether it's melee fighting with my fists, whether it's with an edged weapon, whether it's with a gun, like, yes, that is conflict, right? But conflict is also politics. Conflict is also just anger and, I'm pissed at you because you broke up with me, or you cheated on me, or you hurt me. That's conflict, right? So conflict can be emotional. Conflict can be spiritual. Conflict can be, political. It can be all sorts of different things in different ways. And yes, the most obvious manifestation of this is the physical, conflict that's going to happen. And if you're making an action game and a combat game, then yes, you need to have, a million ways to have conflict in your game. But you need to understand, again, how does conflict enter your story? How does conflict naturally keep coming and keep coming and keep coming into your story? And how do you make that interesting and exciting, right? You don't want it to feel too contrived. And that's the problem with, I think, a lot of conflict feels contrived in a lot of stories. And so we need ways, again, whether you're making Babylon 5 or whether you're making something else, but you need a way to create, these conflicts that keep coming in these layers and these depths and these complexities within the conflict. And that can be really important for you to try to get right, in your game, right? So don't underestimate the need for conflict. Conflict drives most story, and so again, whether this is interpersonal drama or whether it's, one place versus another, one city versus city, one sports team versus another sports team, one company versus another company, one country versus another country, one planet versus another planet, the Star Wars Rebel Alliance versus, the Evil Empire, right? So conflict can happen at any scale. It can be one-on-one, it can be even inner turmoil for all that matters. Like, a lot of times we beat ourselves up, and we're our own worst enemies in these things, right? And so understand where conflict comes from, understand if it's within us, understand if it's because of somebody else, understand if it's the nature of the universe and the world, and how can I affect that conflict? How do I change that conflict as a writer, as a game designer, right? And how do I put the player in the middle of that conflict and make him feel like he matters in it, right? And that's the hard part, right? So I need to feel like I can do something about this conflict, or I'm trying to survive it, or whatever it is, right? But I need to feel like I can either escalate it or de-escalate it. Can I make the conflict worse? Can I choose to do something worse there, or can I de-escalate it? Can I make it a little bit better, right? So that's one of the challenges we have in creating conflict. Now, suspense is a similar thing to conflict, but suspense is really about building tension, right? And so tension is something that's going to really get us on edge, build us up, and then boom, it can explode, right? But the conflict can be that explosion. But if the suspense and the intrigue and the mystery and stuff like that aren't there, the emotional reaction that we're going to have when we're involved in these stories is going to be a lot less, right? And so suspense and that kind of stuff needs to be part of, and the tension needs to be part of the conflict, right? And so it needs to build. It's a volcano that's going to go off, right? And we need to feel that. And that's where, it's, again, this roller coaster of things, but we need to feel that it's going to build, it's going to blow. Oh, okay, it's settled down for a bit now, right? And then suddenly they resolve something, maybe permanently, or maybe just for a bit, right? It got a little bit better. Oh, okay, took some tension off, and something bad happened. Now it gets really intense again, right? And then something, whatever happens, and so the stories want to have that ebb and flow and the pacing, right? And that's something that you really want to try to build and use, and especially if you're building, any kind of a mystery novel or anything like that, you don't just come out and say like, hey, the plumber did it with the candlestick in the in the library, right? Like you don't just come out and give them the answer. The path that most people want to have is trying to figure out the answer, right? They want to try to figure out like what is, what's going on here, and then they're unsolving, or they're solving this puzzle, right? And suspense is kind of part of a puzzle, right? And then it's just like it's adding this tension, but you're trying to figure things out, and there's some kind of intrigue, and there's stuff there that's kind of keeping you like on your toes and keeping you wondering about things, as you're going. And so you want to keep the suspense also working in conjunction with the conflict, so that but again, suspense needs to change and ebb and flow over time, right? You don't want to have the same intensity all the time. It shouldn't just always be like a car chase all the time, right? If your entire movie is a car chase, you're going to get bored. So kind of keep that in mind, right? So we talked a little bit about this in the setting. Since we're almost out of time, we'll kind of blow through these last. We got, looks like, a few more slides here we're going to blow through really quickly. So last, if you guys are still listening and you have any more last minute questions, we're down to like about 10 minutes. So please make sure you ask some questions right now. I'm going to try and wrap up storytelling for today, and an attempt that by next week we're going to get into start building a game together. We're going to start designing and start using some of these techniques in world building. And so we're actually going to do some world building together next week, I hope. And so that's kind of the plan. And so hopefully these last 6-8 weeks that we've been doing all this, you'll be start to see how it all comes together finally. And so so hopefully we'll see you next week as well. But in the meantime, let's blow through this just to make sure we finish up storytelling today. So again, the setting of the world and where it's at and how dangerous it feels, how new it feels, the technology levels, do you build it up very horrifically, or we know there's bad things in the world. Is the world a good place? Is it a peaceful place? How do you set up that setting is going to really affect the overall mood of the player all the time, right? And so if you set up a really happy, nice world, that can be great, but where is the conflict coming from? Where is the suspense coming from, right? So maybe the world's a really nice place, but maybe when I go to work, there's just a lot of conflict at work, right? And maybe the story is not about me going guns blazing, but it's like me in a story about how I'm dealing with my boss at work and my job and getting through the conflict there, right? The rest of the world could be a safe place. So the world itself does not have to inherently always be this horrible place that we go into. That's the easiest stereotypes to get into, but it's not the only way. Characters. This is probably the biggest area that you have as far as impacting what people think, and from the way people act to the way they talk to what they're doing, how they're dressed and how they're looking, their behaviors, their animations. Are they really in your face and they're getting there, or are they like, hey dude, what's up? Right? Like, are they causing conflict? Are they causing drama? Are they making you nervous? Are they adding suspense in there, and stuff. Again, somebody that's, maybe somebody doesn't look like he's all that nice, and he's getting closer to you and he's eyeing you really weird and kind of looking at you, and he's got a stick or something that looks like it could be a weapon. Like, you're going to get really nervous, and that's building suspense, right? And he could just walk right by you and you just realize he's just a weird guy. Like, and so some suspense happened there, but didn't even have to resolve in conflict, right? So all the things that these people have, building up the world and universe of again, do they have nice cars? Are they rich? Are they poor? Are they powerful in politics or in business or all these kinds of things? How do they talk to you? The kinds of information they give you. Characters just have a tremendous amount of way to impact your story, in the game. And we keep talking about this, but I just want to lastly kind of keep reinforcing it, right? That we need to keep creating this ongoing set of enemies and drama that are happening. And it's really hard because we want to feel natural. We want to feel like, okay, yes, there's conflict, there's a bad guy, sub-boss, boss, bad guy, boss, big boss, whatever. And all these things kind of keep happening, but you don't want it to feel so fake that you just kind of after a while go like, why is there like another stupid boss coming? Like, I don't get it. Like, I've already killed 100 of them, and I'm just feeling like 101 just isn't doing it for me, right? So how do these things build on each other? How are they going to really make this world more interesting to you? And ultimately, you want to start putting these things into quests. You want to start putting these things into, what does the player do? So if I'm building a game, what does the player do? But I'd argue that this goes even bigger than just games. If you guys have been watching The Mandalorian, I don't want to ruin it for you, but I often laugh in The Mandalorian because I feel like the quests and the plots and the way it's written, it feels like a video game. There's a lot of really cliche things in The Mandalorian. And don't get me wrong, I love The Mandalorian. I think it's one of the best shows that's come out recently, and I love it. But it just, there's a lot of very cliche writing that just feels like somebody was trying to write a video game, and it's just like, Mando has to go do this in order to get this new piece of weapon upgrade, and then he's going to go do this in order to capture this person, in order to get enough money to get to the next quest, to find his next thing, and it's very video gamey in the way that it's done, and I find that very funny, because it is a little cliche that this top TV series, you could almost take the exact plots from The Mandalorian and put them into a video game and they'd work, right? And so that's what your quests and your subquests and your plots and these subplots and all these things, and like, how does the player get them? Which ones are required? Which ones are optional? How does he find them? Who gives them to them? What kinds of rewards does he give? Is it just some text somewhere that a text objective pops up? Do I get it from a person? Do I get it from some job board in the world? Those kinds of things, right? How are they ultimately controlled in the world is tricky. And so this is a big topic, and maybe we'll get into quest design as a subset in one of these weeks to come, because it is really complicated. Also, just things that are kind of random events, like you can have stuff that just pops up and happens and doesn't necessarily even have to be tied into the overall plots. So yes, it helps if these things do reinforce the plots. But don't be afraid of, again, some old lady running up and going, help me, my cat's in the tree, right? Nothing to do with the main plot, whatever that is. You will find that in even things like The Witcher and stuff, where they'll say, like, my son lost his ball, literally, like, can you find his ball for me? Like, just stupid stuff, but it's like, hey, do I want the reward or not? Do I want to get the experience and get the other stuff? It's up for me to decide, if these random events or have value or not to me. So, last slide here, last 2 minutes of today of this topic. Hopefully you guys are all enjoying this, and hopefully this has been helping you. But where do you start, right? And we're going to see this next week. We're actually going to start here next week and try to figure this out together. But really understanding, what are all your different plots? Who do you have that's working on this with you? Who's your team? What stories have to be told? What stories are kind of secondary, tertiary, optional? Which things are random? Which stuffs relate to quests? Which stuff just relates to random information, right? How is all this going to be infused into your game, right? So next week we're going to get into how do we really build this, right? We're gonna tackle this. Where do you start, right? And so we're going to literally start with a blank piece of paper, I hope, next week. That's kind of this idea, and we're going to try to build this together. So anyways, that's it for today. Again, thank you all for watching, whether you're live or whether you're watching the recording of this. I hope the random ramblings from a madman today helped you guys out a little bit. And thanks again, Malin, and everybody else for joining in and participating today. And we look forward to seeing all of you next week. So be safe, everybody, and take care. Thanks, Big Glob, again, and Drawn Skull. Drawn Skull, where to start is what we talk about next week. So my idea, which I honestly don't know if it's going to work or not, but my idea right now is going to be that we're going to spend some time together. I don't know if that's going to be a month or 2 months or whatever this is. And I think that it would be cool to build a world together and then design a game out of that. And so we're going to kind of sit down and kind of work through the practical exercises, and you're going to see how I design. You're going to see how I work through these things. You're going to see where I start. But we're going to start by world building first, and then we're going to be world building and game designing kind of back and forth. We're going to see how systemic approaches will help us build this whole new place. So we're going to build something new, probably some science fiction universe or something like that. And we're going to see, like, where do we start, when we just are all there together. And you guys would be welcome to give input on it. And hopefully people will give ideas, and we'll just keep writing it down. So, but this is going to be something I see us doing for some period of time to really help you guys understand where and how do you get started. Okay? So, thanks again, everybody. Have a great week, and we will see you hopefully next week. So, take care.